The wind came out of the northwest that March the way it always did in Amarillo, not as a breeze, but as a verdict. It did not whisper. It did not suggest. It arrived like something that had been building for 1,000 miles across flat, indifferent land, and by the time it reached the edge of town, it carried grit and cold, and the particular loneliness that only open country can produce. By 8 o'clock in the evening, the sky had turned the color of a bruise, and the first real gust hit the storefronts along Calvin Street, hard enough to rattle the plate glass windows in their frames. Grace Calloway did not hear any of it. She never had. She stood at the folding counter inside Calloway Clean, the small laundromat she had run for 11 years on the corner of Calvin and Fifth, and she pressed a crease into a man's work shirt with the same slow, deliberate care she brought to everything. Her iron moved in long strokes, heel to toe, the steam rising in curling columns that vanished before they reached the low ceiling. The fluorescent lights above her hummed at a frequency she could not perceive, but she could feel them in the bones behind her eyes. On long nights, a faint pressure, she had learned to live alongside the way a person learns to live alongside any old familiar ache. She was 34 years old, and she was beautiful in the way that women who have never been told they are beautiful sometimes become quietly and without vanity, the kind of beautiful that lives in the architecture of a face and the way a person holds themselves when they think no one is watching. Her hair was dark brown, almost black, pulled back from her face with a rubber band she had found on the floor that morning. Her eyes were the gray-green of the Texas sky just before a storm decides what it wants to be. Her hands, which moved with calm precision over the ironing board, were the hands of someone who had worked since she was old enough to work, capable and slightly roughened at the knuckles, but steady. Always steady. She had been deaf since birth. Not hard of hearing, not partially, completely and without remedy, in a way that doctors in 1969 had explained to her mother with clinical detachment, and her mother had absorbed with the particular grief of a woman who already had very little and was now being asked to make peace with having less. Grace had grown up in the Texas Panhandle, in a town smaller than Amarillo, in a house where communication happened through a combination of handwritten notes, exaggerated lip movements, and the American Sign Language that her mother had learned imperfectly from a library book, and Grace had perfected entirely on her own. She had not attended a school for the deaf. There had not been one close enough. She had attended the same public school as everyone else, sat in the same classrooms, watched the same teachers talk at the same blackboards, and learned to read lips with the concentration of someone diffusing something dangerous. By the time she was 12, she could follow a conversation across a crowded room. By the time she was 16, she could tell when someone was lying from the way the muscles around their mouth tightened a fraction of a second before the words came out. She had not found this remarkable. It was simply what survival required, and Grace Calloway had always been very clear-eyed about what survival required. The laundromat had been her aunt's. Aunt Roberta, who had never married and never explained why, who had smoked unfiltered cigarettes until the cigarettes won, and who had left the business to Grace in a will written on a yellow legal pad and witnessed by her neighbor, a retired postal worker named Harold, who had signed his name so carefully it looked like calligraphy. Grace had been 23 when she inherited it. She had spent the next 11 years turning it from a place that barely broke, even into a place that was genuinely useful to the neighborhood. The kind of business that working people depend on without ever quite thinking about it. The kind that disappears from a street and leaves a hole that chain stores cannot fill. She stayed open until 11 on weeknights, midnight on Fridays and Saturdays. She knew most of her regulars by name. She kept a small shelf near the door with travel-sized detergent and dryer sheets that people could take if they were short, no charge, no questions. She had installed a bench outside with a little covered roof over it because she had noticed that the elderly woman from the apartment building 2 blocks north always had to stand and wait for her ride. And standing was hard on her. She noticed what was needed and she did it. This was not generosity in the way people use that word. It was attention. Full, uninterrupted attention, the kind that develops in a person who receives the world in silence and therefore receives it entirely through what can be seen. The iron moved. The shirt took shape. Outside, the storm was getting serious. She had 2 machines left running. She could feel the vibration of their cycles through the soles of her shoes, a rhythm she knew as well as she knew anything. and she could tell from the subtle change in the pattern that the large front loader in the back corner was approaching the spin cycle. She had learned to read the building the way other people read sound, the way the pipes spoke through the walls when water moved through them, the way the front door transmitted a different vibration when the wind pushed against it than when a person did, the way the concrete floor carried information up through her feet that the air carried to everyone else through their ears. She was folding the shirt when the glass began to shake, not the way it shook in a strong gust, which she knew and had learned to categorize as weather. This was different. The plate glass of the front window trembled in short, sharp intervals, rhythmic, intentional. Someone was hitting it. She turned. The man on the other side of the glass was large, the kind of large that registers before any other detail, broad-shouldered and thick through the chest, wearing a heavy leather vest over a dark shirt. His hair was cut short, and he had several days of stubble on his jaw. His face was not composed. His face was the face of someone who had moved past fear into something beyond it, a kind of stripped-down, functional desperation, the expression of a person spending the last of something. His left hand was pressed flat against the glass. His right hand was tucked against his body at an angle that was not natural. The glass was dark with rain and grit, but where his right side pressed close to the doorframe, where the exterior light caught him, she could see the color. Dark, wet, spreading. She crossed the laundromat floor in 8 steps through the deadbolt and pulled the door open. The wind came in like it had been waiting for permission. The man came in with it, one heavy step and then a second, and Grace got her arm under his right side and took his weight before he could decide whether to let her. He was maybe 6 feet and over 200 pounds, and she was 5'6" and 130, and none of that mattered because she had gotten her center of gravity low and her feet planted before the weight could knock her back. She steered him to the sorting bench along the sidewall, the long wooden one with the padded top she had installed 3 years ago for customers who needed to sit while they waited. She lowered him onto it and stepped back and looked at him the way she looked at everything that required immediate understanding. He was 40, maybe 42. Hard to tell because he had one of those faces that had seen a great deal and wore all of it, the kind of weather that is not simply age but experience compressed into skin. His eyes were dark brown, and right now they were working hard to stay focused, doing the deliberate blink of someone fighting to remain conscious. The leather vest had patches on it. She registered them peripherally the way you register a language you do not speak, but have seen enough to recognize the category. The patch on the chest said Iron Wolves MC. Below it, a rocker that said Amarillo. On the left breast, the words Sergeant at Arms in a curved arc above a small embroidered wolf. His right hand was still clamped over his left shoulder and upper arm, and what was coming through his fingers was not something that slowed on its own. Grace turned and went to the cabinet behind the wash counter, without running, because running was the thing that happened right before panic, and panic was the thing that made hands unreliable. She opened the cabinet and took out the first aid kit, the real one, not the $10 plastic box with the Band-Aids and the alcohol wipes, but the serious one she had assembled herself after the 3rd time in 5 years. She had dealt with a cut that needed more than a bandage, because her neighborhood was the kind of neighborhood where people sometimes arrived at the only open door with problems that required more than a bandage. She pulled on the latex gloves. She came back to him and looked at him directly, and she spoke knowing he did not know she was deaf, knowing her words would be slightly flat in the way that words sometimes are when the person speaking them has never heard themselves. She said, "I need to see it." He blinked. He looked at her with an expression that was trying to calculate something and not quite managing it. Then he moved his hand. The wound was in the soft tissue of the outer shoulder, high up toward the trapezoid. It was a through and through entry and exit, both visible, and it was bleeding steadily, but not in the arterial way that meant there were seconds rather than minutes. She had seen a gunshot wound once before when she was 19, and a man had stumbled into the laundromat in what was still her aunt's time, and her aunt had dealt with it with the same flat practicality that she brought to most things. Grace had watched. She had remembered. She pressed a thick pad of gauze hard against the exit wound, covered it with her left palm, and held. The man's body went rigid for a moment, and then he breathed out, and his shoulders dropped slightly, which she understood as him deciding to trust the process. She looked up at him. She said, "I can help, but no police." It was not a question. She could read in the set of his jaw and the way his eyes had gone to the window twice since she opened the door that police were not part of anything he was considering. She simply wanted him to know she was not considering it either. He nodded once slowly. Grace worked. She had long fingers and a light touch, and she worked the way she did everything with full attention and without wasted motion. She cleaned the wound with saline from the kit. She used the butterfly closures on the exit wound, which had stopped bleeding with pressure, and packed the entry wound with gauze and medical tape because it wanted to keep going. She cut the sleeve from his shirt with the small scissors from the kit, not asking, just doing it, and he let her without protest. She fashioned a pressure bandage from what she had and tied it tight enough to do its work. While she worked, she did not look at his face. Then she did. He was watching her. Not the wound. Her. There was something in the quality of his attention that was not what she expected from a man in his condition. He was watching her the way people watch something they are trying to understand carefully and without pretending they were not. She finished the bandage and stepped back and stripped off the gloves. He said something. She watched his mouth. He said, "You do this before." She said once. A pause. His eyes moved over her face. He said, "You reading my lips?" She said yes. He was quiet for a moment that had a specific quality, the quality of something being reconsidered from the ground up. Then he said, "Sorry." She shook her head. She did not need his sorry. She needed him stable, and she needed to understand what was going to come through her door next. She said, "Who is coming?" He worked his jaw. He said, "Maybe nobody, maybe two men." She said, "What do they want?" He said, "Me gone." She looked at him steadily. Then she said, "Then we make sure they don't find you." She had him move to the space behind the large industrial machines at the back of the laundromat, the corridor between the rear wall and the line of commercial washers, a space wide enough for a person to stand in, but not obvious from the front. She gave him a clean folded shop towel to hold against his shoulder. She gave him a notepad and a pen from the counter because she understood, without having to explain it, that they were going to need to communicate, and his lips would be harder to read in the dark. Then she went back to the counter and picked up the iron and set it on the board and resumed pressing the shirt she had been pressing when the glass began to shake, because the best thing a person could look like when someone came looking was a person who had been doing exactly this all night. She did not have to wait long. She felt it in the floor first. The particular rhythm of two sets of boots on wet concrete, heavier than a regular walk, the cadence of people moving with purpose. Then the sweep of a flashlight beam across the front window, going left to right and back. The door handle moved. It did not turn because the deadbolt was thrown, but it moved, and then there was pressure against the glass, someone leaning close to look in, and Grace kept her eyes down and kept the iron moving and did not look up for 3 full seconds, which is longer than 3 seconds feels when every instinct is pushing in the other direction. Then she looked up as if startled, as if she had just noticed someone at the door. She held up one hand in a gesture that said, "Wait," crossed to the door, and opened it the 4 inches that the security chain allowed. The man on the other side was large and wore a jacket with no patches. His partner stood slightly back to the right. Both of them had the specific stillness of people who were accustomed to using their physical presence as the first part of any conversation. The one at the door said something. She watched his mouth. He said, "You seen a biker. Big guy, dark vest." She shook her head slowly. She pointed at her ear. She shook her head again. She held up the pen from her apron pocket and mimed writing. The man stared at her. Some recalculation happened behind his eyes, not sympathy, just a different kind of calculation. He said something else slower this time. She pointed at her ear again. She said out loud so he could hear the slight flatness of it, "I can't hear you. I'm deaf." He looked past her into the laundromat. She did not move aside. She had positioned herself so that the angle from the doorway gave a clearer view of the front 2/3 of the room, the machines, the folding counters, the bright, clean floor, and nothing else. The back corridor was not visible from this angle. She had measured this with her eyes before she opened the door. He looked at her. He said something to his partner. Then he looked back at her and said slowly and deliberately, "Sorry to bother you." She nodded. She closed the door. She threw the deadbolt. She stood at the counter with the iron in her hand for 4 minutes without moving it, because she had learned long ago that the time to believe a threat is gone is not the moment it appears to leave. At the 4-minute mark, the floor told her nothing new. The window told her nothing new. She put down the iron and went to the back. He was still there. He had used the notepad. On the top sheet in large letters, he had written, "They gone." She took the pen. She wrote, "Yes. 2 men, no patches. They think you're not here." He read it. He wrote, "You didn't have to do that." She took the pen back. She wrote, "I know." He looked at what she had written for a moment longer than was necessary to read 4 words. She brought him water in a paper cup and a package of crackers from the small basket she kept behind the counter for nights when she forgot to eat, which was most nights. She set them down beside him without ceremony. He took the water with his good hand and drank it in 2 long swallows. She sat down on an overturned laundry basket a few feet away, and for a while neither of them did anything except exist in the quiet of the storm and the machines and the particular calm that sometimes comes after something very bad does not happen. At some point after midnight, she realized he was cold. She got up and took a clean shirt from the lost and found box, a man's flannel left months ago by someone who never came back for it, and held it out. He looked at it. He looked at her. He took it. They sat. At 2 in the morning, he was well enough to stand without swaying. She checked the bandage one more time, pressed her fingers gently along the line of the closure to make sure nothing had shifted, and stepped back. He had the notepad. He wrote, "I need to go before light." She nodded. He wrote, "I don't know how to say this." She took the pen. She wrote, "Then don't." He almost smiled. It changed his face entirely briefly, the way sunlight changes a landscape by arriving without warning. He reached into the inner pocket of the leather vest with his good arm. The movement was slow and deliberate, the movement of someone who understands that what they are doing has weight and wants to give it the time it deserves. What he brought out was small enough to fit in his palm. It was a patch, not one of the large back patches or the chapter rockers. It was small, the size of a silver dollar, a single embroidered image on a circular piece of leather that had been cut and stitched by hand, the edges slightly uneven in the way of something made by someone learning as they went. A wolf's head stitched in silver thread on black leather, simple and precise, and worn soft at the edges from years of being carried. He held it out to her. She looked at it. She looked at him. He had the notepad. He wrote, "First thing I ever made for the club. I was 18. I carried it since then." She read it. She looked at the patch. He wrote, "I know that's not enough. There's nothing enough for what you did tonight. But it's the only thing I have that means anything." She took it from his palm. It was warm from being carried against his body for so many years. She turned it over. On the back, the leather was bare and someone had written in black permanent marker, "Faded but legible DR Prospect 1979. She closed her hand around it. She looked at him and she said out loud, "Be careful out there." He read her lips. He nodded. He wrote one last thing on the notepad and held it up. It said, "I owe you everything." She stood in the open doorway and watched him walk out into what remained of the storm. One arm tucked close to his side, his shoulders squared against the wind, in the way of a person who has decided that the weather is not going to be the thing that stops him. He turned the corner at 5th and was gone. Grace closed the door. She looked down at the patch in her hand. She went to the counter and found the Polaroid camera she kept in the cabinet, the one she used occasionally to document damage claims when customers came in complaining about items lost or ruined. She went to the back corridor. She took a photograph of the notepad still on the floor where he had left it, turned to the page that said, "I owe you everything." The camera produced its small square image with the mechanical action she felt in the mechanism under her hands. She waited for it to develop. She looked at it in the dim light. The words were legible. His handwriting was not elegant, but it was clear, the handwriting of someone who thought carefully before putting pen to paper. She put the photograph in the deep pocket of her work apron. She found a small wooden frame in the cabinet under the counter, the kind bought for no reason and kept for no specific purpose, and she cleaned its glass with a shop towel and put the patch inside it and set it on the shelf behind the cash register, between the spare rolls of coin wrappers and the small cactus in the clay pot that had been there since her aunt's time. The silver wolf on black leather, DR 1979. She turned off the lights and locked up and went upstairs to the apartment above the laundromat and sat on the edge of her bed for a while in the dark before she lay down still in her work clothes and stared at the ceiling. She did not know his name. She did not know which direction he had ridden or whether he had made it to wherever he was going. She only knew what the night had asked of her and what she had given, and that those two things had been equal to each other in the way that the right things sometimes are. She fell asleep with her hands still faintly warm from the patch. 20 years is not an abstraction. It is the specific accumulation of 8,000 days, each one arriving with its particular weight of small decisions and ordinary moments and things that needed doing. Grace did not pause to count them often. She simply moved through them the way she moved through everything, with attention and without complaint. The laundromat ran, the machines turned over, and the steam rose, and the customers came with their canvas bags and their plastic hampers and their particular rhythms of need. The young mother on Thursday mornings with her 3 children who played quietly while she folded. The old men from the veterans boarding house on 2nd Street who came every other Saturday and talked at each other the whole time and left generous tips. The night shift nurses from the hospital 4 blocks north who came in exhausted and sat in the plastic chairs with their eyes half closed while the dryers ran. Grace knew them. She knew their patterns and their preferences and when something was wrong. She kept the shelf stocked and the bench outside covered against the rain, and the small cactus alive behind the register, and the silver wolf in its frame on the shelf, the patch she had never told anyone about and had never needed to. Marvella Dixon had been her neighbor since Grace was 25. She lived in the ground floor apartment of the building directly adjacent, separated from the laundromat's side entrance by a narrow alley just wide enough for a person to stand in. She was 61 years old now, and had been a large woman of formidable domestic precision her entire adult life, a retired cafeteria supervisor whose organizational capabilities had never been confined to cafeteria hours. She had learned American Sign Language from Grace over 4 years, imperfectly at first, and then with the competence of someone who decided that imperfect was not going to be good enough and went back and tried again. She brought cornbread on Monday mornings without being asked. She had done this for 19 years. She was the person Grace trusted when trust was required, which was not often because Grace had constructed her life with the care of someone who understands that certain structures bear weight and certain structures do not. In 2012, Grace applied for a small business loan to replace 2 commercial machines that were aging past reliable, and the loan officer at First National Trust had been professional, and the loan had been approved at a rate that was manageable if nothing significant went wrong. In 2014, the pipes under the back wall failed. The repair cost more than the emergency fund, and she took a second small loan for the difference. In 2016, the roof developed a slow leak above the back corner, the same corner where she had hidden the man with the wolf patch from the men with the flashlights. And the repair took everything she had and required extending the first loan's payment term by 18 months. None of this was catastrophic. These were the normal small erosions of a small business operating in a building that was like most buildings in this part of Amarillo, aging in the way that requires constant and moderately expensive attention. What changed in 2016 was not the roof. It was a name she read in the Amarillo Globe News, a developer named Conrad Hale, whose company had acquired a commercial property 2 streets over and announced plans for a mixed-use retail center in the Calvin Street corridor. Grace read the address range in the article. She read the address above her own front door. She noted it and she paid attention. In 2017, without warning, the main water line feeding the back wall failed in a way the plumber described as unusual for a line that age and type. The repair cost enough that she had to defer a loan payment. There was a late fee. In 2019, parking enforcement around the laundromat became suddenly and specifically aggressive. Customers who had parked in the same spots for years began receiving tickets within minutes of arrival. Grace submitted a formal complaint to the city. Nothing changed. 3 regulars stopped coming. In 2021, a representative of Hale Development Group came in on a Wednesday afternoon. He was in his 30s, wearing a jacket that cost more than most of her machines, and he offered to buy the property at a number that was below market value, in the range that signals a buyer who knows the seller may not have the resources to consult an independent appraiser. Grace wrote on the notepad, "I am not interested in selling." The representative smiled and said the offer was open-ended and left a card. Grace put it in the trash when he was gone. In 2022, the loan from First National Trust was sold. She learned about this in a letter that arrived in November. The loan had been acquired by a holding company with a P.O. box address in Austin. 3 months later, a second letter arrived explaining that the remaining balance was being accelerated and the full amount was due within 90 days. $47,800. Grace sat at the counter with the letter for a long time. Then she went to Marvella's door and stood in the warm yellow light of Marvella's kitchen, while Marvella read it twice and set it down, and looked at Grace with the expression of a woman who has seen enough of the world to know what this is and what it leads to. Grace spent that evening and most of the next morning in the Texas Public Records database, following the chain of ownership from the P.O. Box in Austin, backward through 2 holding companies and 1 real estate investment trust, until she arrived at a name listed as majority stakeholder in a parent entity whose assets included the holding company that now owned her debt. Conrad Hale. She sat with that. She thought about 2017 and the unusual pipe failure. She thought about 2019 and the parking enforcement. She thought about the representative in the expensive jacket. She thought about what patience and money and legal process could do to a person who had none of the second and could not afford enough of the third. She had 90 days. She spent them fighting. She wrote letters. She filed a complaint with the Texas Office of Consumer Credit Commissioner. She contacted a legal aid office whose intake coordinator told her they were backed up through the following year. She went to the bank directly and the branch manager told her the loan was no longer held by First National Trust and there was nothing he could do. The 90 days became 60, then 30. Then the eviction notice arrived. It was a Tuesday in November 2023. It gave her 14 days to vacate. After that, the property would be seized and transferred to the holding company as settlement of the outstanding debt. Conrad Hale's name was not on the eviction notice. It was never on any of the documents. It was always one step behind the paper, always filtered through entities and processes that were entirely legal and therefore entirely immune to the kind of objection that has no courtroom and no attorney. Grace stood at the counter holding the notice. Behind the register, the silver wolf in its small frame caught the afternoon light the way it always did at this hour. She reached up and took the frame off the shelf. She opened it and removed the patch. She held it in both hands and looked at it for a long time. The wolf's head, the black leather worn soft with years. On the back, in faded permanent marker, DR Prospect 1979. She had spent 20 years not looking for him. She had understood from the moment she watched him turn the corner and into the remnants of the storm that what had happened in her laundromat that night existed in a specific enclosed space of time, that reaching back into it would require something of him that he had not offered, and she had no right to ask for. He had given her the only thing he had that meant anything. She had given him what the night required. They were even. But the laundromat was not just a building. It was 11 years of her labor and her aunt's before that. It was every customer she had known by name and every act of quiet attention she had paid to the people who needed someone to pay it. It was the only thing she had. She went to Marvella's door. Marvella read the eviction notice. She set it down. Grace held up the patch. Marvella had heard Grace's version of that night, not completely, not all at once, but in pieces over the years, the way certain stories come out when the conditions are right. She knew enough. She signed, "What do you need me to do?" Grace went back upstairs. She found a padded envelope in the cabinet over the refrigerator. She wrote on it the only address she had ever found for Iron Wolves MC Amarillo, a chapter address she had located in 2004 out of a curiosity she had not entirely been able to justify to herself and had written in the back of her address book and not looked at again. She put the patch in the envelope. She put in with it the Polaroid photograph. The photograph of the notepad, the handwriting in large clear letters, "I owe you everything." She sealed the envelope. She went back to Marvella's door. She signed, "I need you to drive this to this address." Not mail it. Drive it. Marvella looked at the address. She looked at Grace. She signed when? Grace signed now, please. Marvella took her keys off the hook by the door without another word. She was back in 40 minutes. She signed there was a young man at the door. I gave it to him. He looked at the patch and his face changed. Grace signed it. How did it change? Marvella thought for a moment. She signed like someone just told him something he had been waiting to hear. Grace nodded. She went back to the laundromat. She turned on the lights and started the machines and stood at the counter and pressed the day's shirts and waited. She did not know if anyone would come. She had no reason to believe that a man who had walked out of her door 20 years ago, owed her anything beyond the words on a notepad. She had sent the patch to find him, and she had done what she could do, and now she worked because the work was still there, and the customers still needed it, and that had not changed because of her situation. She pressed the shirts. She turned the machines. She kept the shelf stocked. She watered the cactus. She looked at the empty frame behind the register where the patch had been, and she waited. The envelope arrived at the Iron Wolves clubhouse on a Tuesday evening at 6:43, placed into the hands of a 23-year-old prospect named Tyler Briggs, who had been with the club for 11 months and who had never in his life seen the older members react the way they reacted. When the vice president, a man named Roy Weaver, opened the padded envelope in the common room and looked at what was inside, Roy Weaver was 54 years old and had been with Iron Wolves Amarillo for 26 years. He was not a man given to visible emotion. He had a face that most people described as a landscape that had survived a number of significant weather events, and the expression it wore in most circumstances was one of settled, watchful calm. Roy held the small, circular patch between his thumb and forefinger and looked at it the way a man looks at something he was not certain he would ever see again. The silver wolf on black leather, the edges hand-stitched, the back turned over the faded marker inscription visible in the overhead light. Roy said out loud to no one in particular, "Where did you get this?" Tyler said a woman brought it. Older lady, gray hair, drove a Buick. She said to make sure it got to someone who would know what it meant. Roy looked at the photograph that had been in the envelope with the patch. He looked at it for a long time. He looked at the return address on the envelope. Callaway Clean, 2214, Calvin Street, Amarillo, Texas. He set everything carefully on the table. He took out his phone. The number he dialed rang 4 times before it was answered, and when the voice on the other end came through, Roy, Weaver said only, "Danny, I have something you need to see." Danny Roth had been a nomad for 10 years. This was not the same as leaving it, and the distinction mattered. A nomad carried his full patch in his full standing, but was not bound to a single chapter. He moved. He went where the road and the work and whatever obligations remained in him required. He answered to the national structure and could be called upon by any chapter that needed him, and when he was needed, he came. He had become a nomad in 2013, not because he had walked away from the club, but because Amarillo had stopped being a place he could stay, for reasons that lived in a part of him he had not fully opened to anyone. He was 62 years old. He was in Lubbock when Roy called. He listened to what Roy said. Roy described the envelope and the patch and the photograph. He described the address on the return label. He described the woman in the Buick who had brought it and what she had said. Danny said, "Tell me the address again." He wrote it on the back of a gas receipt. He looked at it. The handwriting on the notepad and the photograph blown up on his phone screen was his. He knew it was his before he looked carefully, because there are things a person writes once in their life that they do not forget. "I owe you everything." He had meant it. He had meant it for 20 years. He said to Roy, "I need to know what is happening at that address." "Find out tonight," Roy said, already on it. What Roy found he relayed in a text message 3 hours later. The property at 2214 Calvin Street was subject to an active eviction order issued November 7th with a 14-day compliance window. The debt instrument underlying the eviction had been acquired from First National Trust by a holding company called Southwest Corridor Properties, LLC, majority ownership traceable to Conrad Hale, CEO of Hale Development Group, Amarillo. Danny looked at the name. He had been looking at that name in his mind for 20 years. He had been 19 years old when he first heard Conrad Hale's name, not in 2003, but years before, when Hale was a younger and hungrier developer who had identified the Calvin Street corridor as the most undervalued commercial stretch in Amarillo and had begun the slow, methodical work of clearing it. Iron Wolves had operated a storage arrangement on the south end of the corridor with the informal understanding of the property owner, a handshake arrangement that Hale had found inconvenient when he acquired the surrounding parcels. Hale had gone to the chapter through intermediaries first. The chapter had declined to move. The ambush in the parking lot in March 2003 had not been random. 2 men with a specific assignment and a specific target. Danny had been sergeant-at-arms, the most visible and most operational member of the chapter leadership. Removing him was meant to be the first move in a longer sequence. A woman in a laundromat had interrupted that sequence. He had known this. He had lived with the knowledge of it for 20 years, turning it over the way you turn over something you cannot put down and cannot fully hold the knowledge that the woman who had pressed a gauze pad against his shoulder in the dark and lied to two armed men at a door had done it with no understanding of what she was sitting in the middle of. No understanding that the men at the door had been sent by someone who wanted her street and did not care what was in the way. And now that same man was using the law to take the only thing she had. Danny called Roy back. He said, call a meeting for Thursday morning. Full chapter. I need Arthur Gallagher on the phone from Dallas. Roy said, how many are you thinking for Friday? Danny said enough to make the point. I want 60, maybe 65. Chapter members and nomads in range. And Roy, nobody touches anything before I get there. I want 2 prospects watching the laundromat from tomorrow morning. Watching only. If anyone approaches that building before Friday, I want to know within 5 minutes. Roy said done. Danny ended the call and sat in the parking lot of the motel in Lubbock and looked at the lights of the city and thought about the shape of what was going to happen in 5 days and about a woman he had never thanked properly and about a debt that had been accumulating interest for 2 decades in the place where he kept the things that mattered. He started the engine and pointed the bike south toward Amarillo. The 2 prospects Roy sent were named Cal and Denny, 22 and 24, and they understood their assignment, the clarity that Roy conveyed assignments. They parked on the south side of 5th Street and watched the laundromat in shifts from 8 in the morning until midnight, 2 days running. On the second day at 2 in the afternoon, a man in a dark sedan parked in front of the laundromat and went inside. He was in his 30s, well-dressed. He stayed for 12 minutes. Cal photographed the sedan and its plates. Roy ran them that evening. The sedan was registered to Hale Development Group. What the man had said to Grace on that second visit was not a softer version of the first. The offer now had a specific number and a specific deadline, and it was accompanied by a statement that he delivered slowly and clearly in the way of someone performing a consideration they do not actually feel. He said, we are aware of an incident from March 2003 in which you concealed a wanted member of a criminal organization and obstructed a lawful search of these premises. We have documentation from the Amarillo Police Department. This does not have to become complicated. Signed by Friday, and none of this goes anywhere. Grace looked at him. She wrote on the counter notepad, get out of my store. He picked up his folder. He said Friday. He left. Grace stood at the counter after he was gone and breathed the way she had learned to breathe in the difficult moments, slowly and from the bottom. She looked at the empty frame behind the register. She picked up the notepad. She wrote, not for anyone to read, just to write it. I don't know if anyone is coming, but I did the right thing then. I will do the right thing now. She set the pen down. She went back to work. The meeting Roy called for Thursday morning had 14 members present and Arthur Gallagher on speakerphone from Dallas. Arthur Gallagher was slightly built, wore wire-rimmed glasses, and had been the club's legal counsel for 18 years. He had a mind that operated with the methodical precision of someone who found the complexity of law genuinely interesting rather than merely useful. Danny stood at the head of the table and laid out what he knew in the order in which it was relevant. He described the night in March 2003. He described the wound in the laundromat in the woman. He described the 2 men with the flashlights and what he had learned afterward about who had ordered the ambush and why. He placed Conrad Hale at the origin of the 2003 attack. He described the years of pressure applied to the laundromat since then, the pipe failure, the parking enforcement, the below-market offer, the loan transfer. He described what the Hale development representative had said to Grace about the 2003 incident. The room was quiet in the specific way of people processing a number of things simultaneously. Arthur Gallagher said the thread about the 2003 incident is largely empty. The statute of limitations for the state-level obstruction charge has long expired. It is a pressure tactic and not a strong one. What they are actually relying on is the debt instrument. The holding company purchased the debt legitimately. There is no procedural irregularity in the purchase itself. What there may be irregularity in is the relationship between Conrad Hale and First National Trust's decision to sell that particular debt to that particular buyer. If Hale had any undisclosed relationship with a decision-maker at First National Trust, there may be grounds to challenge the transfer's validity. Danny said, how long does that take? Arthur said longer than 14 days, but there is a faster option. If a third party purchases the debt from the holding company at or above the outstanding value, the holding company loses its legal standing and the eviction order becomes void. Danny said, "What is the outstanding amount?" Arthur said, $47,800 principal plus accumulated fees. Ashyems. Call it 52,000 with current costs. Roy looked at Danny. Danny said, "We can do 52,000. Arthur said, "I will draft the acquisition documents today." But Danny completing the transfer retires the immediate threat. It does not address Conrad Hale. He will find another instrument. Danny said, "I know, so I want you to look at everything. The 2003 ambush, the pipe failure in 2017, the parking enforcement in 2019, the loan transfer, all of it. I want to know what connects and what can be documented, and I want the right people to hear it." Arthur was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right, I will start pulling threads on Monday." The meeting ended at 11:30. Roy stayed after the others left, and the two men sat at the long table in the quiet of the clubhouse, the way men sit who have known each other long enough that silence does not require filling. Roy said, "She doesn't know you're coming." Danny said, "No." Roy said, "You going to call ahead?" Danny said, "She sent the patch. She sent the photograph. She did not send a phone number or a letter asking for anything. She made one move and then she waited. I am going to respond in kind." Roy looked at him. Danny said, "She deserves to see it, not to be warned about it, to see it arrive." In the laundromat on Calvin Street, the days moved with the particular slowness of a deadline that cannot be reasoned with. Grace worked. She kept the machines running and the shelves stocked, and she responded to her customers with the same attentiveness she had always given them. On the fourth day after she sent the envelope, a small thing happened that she might not have noticed if she had not been paying the kind of attention she had been paying her entire life. There was a motorcycle parked on the south side of Fifth Street. It had been there the previous morning. It was there again in approximately the same position, and the rider was not present. She watched it for an hour through the front window. No one came for it. The next morning it was there again, and this time the morning light showed her a second bike slightly further down the block, parked in the shadow of a delivery truck. Two bikes. Two positions that gave sight lines to her front door and her side entrance. She stood at the counter and thought about this for a long time. Then she looked at the empty frame on the shelf behind the register. She understood. She did not know how far the envelope had gone or who had read the photograph or what had been decided. But two motorcycles on her street positioned with the care of people who did not want to be noticed but wanted to be there told her enough. She was not alone. She went to the back room and made herself a cup of coffee on the hot plate and sat down on the overturned laundry basket in the back corridor, in the exact space where she had sat across from him 20 years ago, and she drank the coffee and let herself feel for the first time in weeks the specific unclenching of something that had been held very tight. On the ninth day, the man from Hale Development came back. He was no longer performing consideration. He said, "The deadline is in 5 days. I need an answer." Grace looked at him. She wrote, "My answer is the same as before." He said, "You have no lawyer and no money and no recourse. I am offering you a way to leave with something." Grace looked at him steadily. She wrote, "I have been in this building for 22 years. I am not leaving with something. I am staying with everything." He stared at what she had written. Then he picked up his jacket and walked out. That night, Grace sat at the kitchen table and wrote in her small notebook. She wrote about the two motorcycles on the street. She wrote about the empty frame. She wrote about the man from Hale and the moment his certainty had flickered when he read what she wrote. She wrote, "I don't know who is coming or when, but something is in motion. I can feel it the way I feel everything. Not through hearing, through the floor." She closed the notebook and went to bed. The 14th day arrived the way deadlines always do not, with drama, but with the ordinary progression of morning light through unwashed windows, the particular gray of a November dawn in the Texas panhandle that carries no warmth and makes no promises. Grace was awake before sunrise. She came downstairs at 6:30 and turned on the lights and started the first machines of the day out of habit, because the habits of 11 years do not pause for the circumstances of a single morning. The shelf behind the register held the empty frame. She had left it empty because empty was what it was. Marvella came at 7 with cornbread wrapped in a dish towel. She let herself in with the key Grace had given her 3 years ago and set the cornbread on the counter and looked at Grace. She signed, "How are you doing?" Grace signed, "I am scared and I am ready," both at the same time. Marvella nodded. She sat in one of the plastic chairs by the front window and drank the coffee Grace made on the hot plate and watched the street. The two of them had done this before, sat together in the early morning quiet while the machines ran and the day built itself outside the glass, and it had always been one of the things Grace was quietly grateful for, the specific comfort of a person who knew how to be present without requiring anything from the presence. At 9 o'clock, a county vehicle pulled up across the street. The deputy who stepped out stood on the sidewalk and looked at the building with the expression of a person who has been given an assignment they did not choose. At 9:15, a black SUV arrived and Conrad Hale stepped out. He was 62 years old and dressed in the way that men with money dress when they want to communicate that the outcome of a thing has never been in question. His lawyer followed a half step behind carrying a briefcase. Conrad Hale looked at the laundromat with the expression of a man looking at something he has already mentally replaced with something else, already seeing the building that will stand here after this building is gone. Grace watched him from behind the counter. She straightened. She was not going to be erased today. At 9:40, Marvella stood up from her chair. She was looking at the street to the north, her expression shifting into something Grace could not immediately read. She turned and looked at Grace, and she signed slowly. Grace. Grace came around the counter and stood next to her at the window. The street to the north was doing something. She put her hand flat on the plate glass. The vibration came through the glass, faint but real, and it was building. She had not felt this in 20 years, but she knew it immediately. The way you know something stored not in memory but in the body itself, below the place where memories live. She had felt it once before on a March night in 2003, and she had not known then what it meant, and she knew now. The first light appeared at the far end of Calvin Street, headlights in the gray November morning, low and steady. Then a second, then more than she could count individually, resolving from the distance as a single mass of light spreading across the width of the road. Conrad Hale had turned from the laundromat to look. His lawyer had turned. The deputy had turned his hand going to his belt and then dropping when he understood that the scale of what was coming was not a situation his belt was going to clarify. They came down Calvin Street at a pace that was deliberate and unhurried. The pace of people who have decided how this morning goes and are in no particular hurry to prove it because they already know. 67 motorcycles, 3 across where the street allowed it, their engines running in the low registered frequency that Grace felt as a pressure against the bottom of her sternum, a steady, insistent percussion that was not sound but was not nothing either. They filled the street. They parked across the sidewalks and along the curb and in the small adjacent lot. The engines cut one by one and the vibration fell away in stages until the last one died, and what replaced it was a silence that had a different quality than silence usually has, the quality of many people choosing not to speak. Conrad Hale stood on the sidewalk, and he was no longer wearing the expression of a man looking at something already replaced in his mind. From the center of the pack, a single rider dismounted. He was tall, broader through the shoulders than he had been 20 years ago, but otherwise built along the same lines. His hair had gone from dark to silver gray. His face was the face she remembered, and also not the way all faces are themselves, and also what time has made of them, the underlying structure unchanged, but the surface detailed now by decades of wind and sun and a life lived mostly outdoors. The leather vest was clean and dark, the patches in their places. On the chest, where it had said Sergeant-at-Arms 20 years ago, it now said Nomad. She registered the change. 20 years ago, his patch had named his role in a single place. Now it named his way of moving through all places. She did not know yet what the difference had cost him, but she could see in the set of his jaw that it had cost something. He walked toward the laundromat. He came through the door and stopped just inside, taking in the room with the same assessment. She remembered the inventory of a person who has trained themselves to understand a space immediately. His eyes went around the counter, the machines, the shelf behind the register, the empty frame. He looked at the empty frame for a moment. Then he looked at her. She was standing 6 feet away in her work apron with her hands at her sides, and she was 54 years old, and she had not slept well, and she had been afraid and ready in equal measure since before sunrise, and she looked at him and did not look away. He reached into the inner pocket of his vest. He brought out the patch. The small circular piece of leather, the silver wolf on black, the edges hand-stitched by an 18-year-old who had not known yet what his life was going to be made of. He held it out to her on his open palm. She looked at it. She looked at him. He said, reading her lips in return, the way she had taught herself to read his, "You kept the photograph." She said out loud, "For 20 years. He reached into his other pocket and brought out a small square of paper folded once. She took it and unfolded it. It was a copy of the Polaroid printed on regular paper. The notepad on the floor of the back corridor, his handwriting in large clear letters. "I owe you everything." Below those words in different ink, clearly recent, someone had added 4 more words in the same hand. "And now I do." She looked up at him. He was holding his face steady, and his eyes were clear, and everything below the surface was moving, and she could read all of it because, yes, she had been reading what faces did not say for her entire life. She took the patch from his palm. She turned and set it in the empty frame behind the register. She pressed it into place behind the glass. She set the frame back on the shelf. Then she turned back to him. Outside, the situation on the sidewalk was developing. Arthur Gallagher had come through the laundromat door, slightly built, wire-rimmed glasses, leather vest over a button-down shirt. He carried his briefcase to where Conrad Hale stood with his lawyer and the deputy, and he introduced himself with the calm of a man who has done this before. He said, "My name is Arthur Gallagher. I represent Pacific Coast Holdings, LLC, which as of 11/17 this morning is the legal holder of the debt instrument formerly held by Southwest Corridor Properties. I have the transfer documentation here if you would like to review it. The eviction order is void." He produced the folder and handed a copy to the deputy, who scanned it with his eyebrows rising steadily toward his hairline. Hale said, "This transfer is irregular. I intend to challenge it." Arthur said, "You are welcome to do so. While you are preparing that challenge, there is something else I want you to hear, Mr. Hale, because I believe in being direct." He paused. He looked at Hale with the wire-rimmed glasses and the complete professional neutrality that was more unsettling than any expression of hostility would have been. He said, "In March of 2003, 2 men you employed attempted to kill Danny Roth in a parking lot 4 blocks from where we are standing. The purpose was to remove Iron Wolves MC's operational presence from this corridor so that your acquisitions could proceed without interference. Mr. Roth survived because a woman in a laundromat on this street opened her door and kept him alive through the night. That woman is standing inside this building right now. She has been on this street for 22 years. You have spent the last 7 of those years using every legal instrument available to you to remove her from it. You targeted her specifically because she was alone and because you believed she would eventually run out of resources to fight you. What you did not know, and what I think you understand now, is that she was never as alone as you believed." Hale's jaw moved. His lawyer touched his arm. Arthur continued, "We have been in contact with 2 former loan officers at First National Trust who have indicated willingness to speak with federal investigators regarding the terms of the debt transfer from First National to Southwest Corridor Properties. We have also retained a forensic accounting firm that has identified a pattern of transactions between Hale Development Group and certain city officials between 2015 and 2021 relating to zoning decisions and enforcement activities in this corridor. That documentation is being shared with the appropriate federal agencies. This is not a threat. This is a courtesy. I would strongly suggest you speak with your own counsel this afternoon." Hale stood on the sidewalk, and the color had gone out of his face. He looked at the laundromat window. Grace was standing at the counter inside. She had been watching Arthur speak. She could not hear any of it, but she had been reading lips for 40 years, and the distance and the glass were not obstacles enough to stop her from following what was being said. She had read all of it. The 2003 ambush, the deliberate targeting, the years of pressure applied with knowledge and intent, the fact that Conrad Hale had known exactly what he was dismantling and had chosen to dismantle it anyway. She stood at the counter with her hands flat on the surface, and she breathed slowly and from the bottom, and she looked at the man on the sidewalk who had spent 7 years trying to erase her. And she felt something that was not triumph and not relief, but something older and more structural, the feeling of a thing that has been leaning against a wall, finally being allowed to stand upright on its own. Danny was standing beside her. She had not heard him move to her side, but she felt the change in the air and turned, and he was there close enough that she could see his expression clearly. He was watching Hale. Then he turned and looked at her, and what she saw in his face was not satisfaction. It was something quieter. The look of a man who has been carrying a specific weight for a very long time and has just been allowed to set it down. Outside, Hale said something to his lawyer. The lawyer nodded, and they walked to the black SUV and got in and drove away, leaving the street to 67 motorcycles in the November light, and one deputy who stood on the sidewalk for a long moment and then looked at Roy Weaver and nodded once in the acknowledgement of a man who knows what just happened and has decided that the appropriate response is to get in his vehicle and handle the other things waiting for him today. He drove away. Danny turned to Grace. He wrote on the counter notepad, "It is yours. Arthur put the title in your name this morning. No encumbrances, no conditions. It is yours entirely." Grace read it. She looked at the shelf behind the register. The patch in its frame, the silver wolf on black leather back, where it had been for 22 years, back where it belonged. Marvella appeared at the laundromat door. She looked at Grace. She looked at Danny. She looked at the full street of motorcycles and the autumn light coming through the windows and the expression on Grace's face. She walked to the counter and stood next to Grace, and she signed with the slow, precise deliberateness of someone who wants every word to land. "You are home. You are staying home." Grace looked at her. She signed back yes. Marvella looked at Danny. In the sign vocabulary she had spent 4 years learning and the last week reviewing with particular attention to words she thought might be needed, she signed to him carefully. "Thank you for coming." Danny read the signs. He had been working at this vocabulary for weeks, since the night Roy called, with the focus of a man who has identified something important and is not going to approach it underprepared. His response was imperfect. The grammar approximated the hand shape, not quite right on 2 of the words, but the meaning was clear. He signed, "Thank you for driving the envelope." Marvella looked at his signing. She looked at Grace with an expression of complete satisfaction. She signed to Grace in the small, discreet way of a private aside he practiced. Grace signed back, "I can see that." Later that evening, when the chapter members had dispersed to the bar 3 streets over, that Roy had arranged for the occasion, Grace and Danny sat in the laundromat in the quiet after the day. The machines finally stilled, in November dark, settled fully outside the windows. They sat on the sorting bench along the side wall, the same bench, the same corner, where it had started 20 years ago. And they talked in the way they had been learning to talk, through the notepad and the phone screen, and the imperfect growing sign vocabulary, and the lip reading that Grace had been doing her entire life, and that Danny was beginning to understand was a form of attention so complete that it amounted to something close to listening. She wrote, "Arthur said Conrad Hale ordered the 2003 ambush to clear the street. He said I was in the middle of something I didn't know I was in." Danny read it. He was quiet for a moment. He wrote, "Yes. I knew it was Hale who ordered it. I learned that in the weeks after. I have known it for 20 years. She wrote, "Why didn't you come back and tell me?" He read it. He set the pen down. He picked it up. He wrote, "Because telling you would have meant coming back. And coming back would have meant asking something of you that I hadn't earned. I didn't know how to come back and be worth the coming back." She read it twice. She wrote, "You came back with 67 motorcycles and a Dallas lawyer and a paid-off deed. That is worth something." He read it. The almost smile appeared again, the one that changed his face entirely. She wrote, "I kept the patch for 20 years. I think you can figure out what that means without me spelling it out." He looked at what she had written for a long time. He reached into his vest pocket and set the small circular patch on the bench between them. The silver wolf on black leather, the hand-stitched edges, the faded inscription on the back. "DR Prospect, 1979. He wrote, "I want you to keep it." She looked at him. He wrote, "Not in a frame, in your pocket, where things that matter actually live." She looked at the patch for a long moment. Then she picked it up and put it in the pocket of her work apron, where the Polaroid photograph had lived for 20 years. She wrote, "Same time tomorrow." He read it. He looked at her. He wrote, "I am not in a hurry to be anywhere else." Marvella appeared in the doorway with the remaining cornbread from the morning and 2 mugs of coffee from the hot plate in the back room, and she set them down on the sorting bench with the manner of a woman depositing something long overdue, and said to the room in general, though neither of its occupants could hear her, "It is about time." The week that followed had the texture of aftermath, The particular quality of time that comes after a storm resolves and the ordinary work of clearing and rebuilding begins. Arthur Gallagher filed the property documentation on Monday as promised. The county recorder processed it by Wednesday. Grace received a paper in an envelope that said in the unadorned language of official documents that the property at 2214 Calvin Street, Amarillo, Texas, was held in fee simple absolute by Grace Ann Calloway with no encumbrances. She read the phrase fee simple absolute. It meant the property was hers entirely with no conditions and no qualifications and no one else's claim on any part of it. She put the document in the file cabinet where she kept the important papers, the one with the combination lock that had been her aunt's, and she went back to work. The investigation into Conrad Hale moved in the patient incremental way of processes involving multiple agencies and large amounts of documentary evidence. Arthur sent brief, precise updates every 2 weeks. In March of the following year, 18 months after the morning on Calvin Street, Conrad Hale was indicted on 11 federal counts including wire fraud, bribery of public officials, and conspiracy to commit financial fraud. The indictment was reported in the Amarillo Globe News. The article mentioned Hale Development Group in the Calvin Street corridor and the investigation that had precipitated the charges. It did not mention Grace by name. She set the phone down. She looked at the shelf behind the register. The frame was there, but the patch was not in it anymore. The patch was in her apron pocket, where it had been every day since November, where things that matter actually live. Danny came back to Amarillo in April. He came alone and parked outside the laundromat and came in on a Thursday morning when the place was quiet and sat on the sorting bench, and they talked for 2 hours using the notepad and the phone and the sign vocabulary he had been methodically expanding since November, adding words the way a person adds tools deliberately and with a clear sense of what they are building toward. He came back in August. Somewhere between April and August, the question of when he was leaving stopped being the organizing fact of his visits and became instead a thing that was discussed practically the way people discuss practical things when they are making a life rather than passing through one. In October, he asked Grace by way of the notepad at the folding counter on a Tuesday evening with the machines running and Marvella ostentatiously reading a magazine in the corner chair, whether she thought the apartment above the laundromat was large enough for 2 people. She read it. She looked at him. She took the pen. She wrote it, depends on whether both people are the kind who take up a lot of room. He read it. He wrote, I travel light. She wrote, then it is probably large enough. Marvella turned a page of her magazine with the expression of a woman who has been waiting for this particular sentence for approximately 11 months and is choosing to receive it with dignity. The laundromat ran. The machines turned and the steam rose and the customers came with their bags and their hampers and their particular rhythms of need, the same rhythms they had always had, the same ordinary and essential requirements of daily life that had kept Calloway clean alive through 11 years of Grace's labor and her aunt's before that. Grace stood at the counter in the morning light, and she was not afraid, and she was not waiting, and the patch was in her apron pocket, and the frame behind the register held a photograph. Now the copy of the Polaroid that Danny had brought with him in November, the notepad on the floor of the back corridor, and the handwriting in large clear letters, the original words and the 4 words added below them. I owe you everything, and now I do. She was home. She was staying home. She had paid 22 years of attention to the street and this building and the people who needed what she had to offer, and the street had held her in return in the way that streets sometimes hold the people who tend them faithfully, not with sentiment, but with the solid, durable fact of their continued presence. The fact of still being there when the storm passes and the light comes back through the windows and the machines begin their familiar rhythm under your feet, speaking in the language you have spent your whole life learning to read.